say it's never going to happen. And it did.
May 18th, 1980. A day that lives in Northwest infamy.
Blue lightning bolts were cracking through the sky.
The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens was the most destructive in U.S. history.
Even today, when I talk about it, the hair on the back of my head stands up.
57 people died. More than 200 homes were destroyed.
Windows of the car got hot to the touch, and that was kind of spooky.
Ash turned day into night, blanketing communities hundreds of miles away. Mudslides churned down river systems, wiping out everything in their path.
The May 18 eruption of 1980 is known internationally as one of the most important eruptions of the modern era.
Tonight, we dive into that day as it unfolded, explore what we've learned in the decades since, and look ahead to preparations for future eruptions. Past, present, future, the 45th anniversary of the Mount St. Helens eruption. Over the next half hour, we will revisit that monumental event through footage dug out of the Katu archives. Hear stories told through the eyes of witnesses, learn from scientists studying the volcano, and sit down with some of the agencies that would respond during a future event. I'm Steve Dunn.
I'm Dave Selesky. Thank you for joining us this evening. We begin with stories of 3 people who experienced the eruption firsthand that day. Katu's Jesse Satin sat down with Mark Smith, whose family was personally impacted.
Mark Smith was 20 years old when a series of small earthquakes
Another earthquake.
signaled Mount St. Helens was rousing from its slumber in March of 1980.
My claim to fame was I'm the youngest member of the Smith family that owned and operated Spirit Lake Lodge at Mount St. Helens.
There is something happening here on Mount St. Helens.
After several days of rumbling, the mountain erupted for the first time in over 100 years. Explosions of steam burst through the volcano's ice cap, burrowing out a crater and blanketing the summit with ash.
When the mountain started to awaken March 27th, it was exciting in this area. People didn't really know what a volcano was.
Over the following weeks, activity continued. The crater widened. Deep cracks split the summit. More than 10,000 earthquakes rattled the mountain, along with more small eruptions. Meanwhile, a bulge started growing on the mountain's north side.
It was moving outwards right before the eruption at a rate of about 4 to 5 feet per day.
Washington's governor established a 5-mile radius red zone around Mount St. Helens, prohibiting anyone except for scientists and law enforcement from going in. On May 17th, the Smith family and others were allowed back in.
I was at the mountain up until 5:30 that evening with about 120 other folks.
One thing Mark regrets from that day, not grabbing the family photos, thinking there would be another chance.
Lo and behold, on May 18th, a 5.1 earthquake shook the North Slope and created the world's largest recorded landslide, 1 cubic mile, come rolling off the mountain, unleashing a lateral blast. It started as a small plume, and then it grew just into this atomic explosion within moments. And then the blue lightning bolts cracked through the sky. Something just unbelievable had happened. And I got excited, hopped in my Jeep, started driving towards the mountain.
Mark got as far as Tootle, where a sheriff's deputy stopped him from going any further.
And his radio was going off that there was a log jam coming downstream. And we started hearing the snapping and cracking, and we turned, and these big logs come ripping down around the river, and it's about 25 feet high with just a flood. And they come down and they slam into the bridge and slam into the whole area, and it's just an unbelievable length of logs.
That early morning mud flow down the South Fork of the Tootle River was one of several lahars triggered by the eruption. Later in the afternoon, another lahar 10 times bigger than those before it charged down the North Fork.
It came around the corner, and the steam and the smell was like sulfur. And on top of the mud flow were log trucks, pieces of houses, where the mud was so heavy it lifted it up and carried it downstream with it.
Mark left that day unscathed, but his family would later learn their lodge was buried under an estimated 500 feet of mud and ash. The blast and ensuing eruption gutted Mount St. Helens, shedding 1,300 feet from its elevation.
The 1980 eruption became one of the biggest international news stories of the year. K2 crews cover the evolving events day in and day out. Some had their own close encounters with what Mount St. Helens had in store. Katu was on the front lines through every earthquake, eruption, and mud flow of the 1980 cycle.
When Mount St. Helens started, it was an international story. You know, all the networks came up here, and all the crew here was working very, very hard. And everybody was flying helicopters around.
We finally put down about 50 feet from the lip of the crater. The helicopter sank several inches in the thick mud. Earthquakes are continuing on the mountain. We can't tell how strong they are, but they've opened up deep cracks only about 5 feet from the edge of the volcano.
Bob Foster had just joined K2 as an intern photojournalist earlier that year.
Once it really blew, it was all hands on deck.
First, Bob was tasked with taking some gear to a team already out in the field.
And then I first catch sight of the mountain for the first time. It's just overwhelming as I approach the interstate bridge. And I get on the radio, and I'm just like, oh my God, it's going off really big. And I go, yeah, Bob, we know.
After dropping off the gear, Bob was sent on another mission. A radio reporter for our Seattle sister station had been evacuated from an area near the mountain, leaving his rental car behind. Bob was asked to pick him up and take him back in to get his car. So they set off down Spirit Lake Highway in Bob's news car, a Chevy Citation.
About milepost 16, we got out of the car, and there I saw the Toutle River full of logs, full of mud. The trees were cartwheeling down the river.
They get back on the road. Then coming down another hill, they see mud oozing over the highway.
Everywhere you looked in the forest, the underbrush was moving because the mud was rising. And so I turned around, and the road we had just come down, the mud had pushed out a big stump, and I'm going to guess there were telephone wires across the road. So now we were trapped.
The mud kept coming in about, like I said, 1-inch waves like concrete. And so I jumped in the car, and then a couple minutes later another wave came and it moved the car just ever so slightly. And that was when I decided to roll down the window and turn off the car and grab all the gear and jump out.
And be written on the front here, 5/19, that's the Monday afterwards. And what's the first one? News car mudslide.
A true photojournalist, Bob documented the entire thing. Later, he caught a ride out, leaving the news car behind. The car stayed stuck on Spirit Lake Highway for some time until the mud dried out.
And so we come back out, and we see this tow truck has this Chevy Citation, and it's being held up like a halibut that's been caught in Alaska. And somebody's there with a garden hose just going.
Bob stayed with K2 for the next 40 years and covered Mount St. Helens when it erupted again in 2004.
There was an urgency, but it's sort of like we've already done the drill. And also the USGS and the state of Washington knew that, like, okay, here's where we need to pull people back at least to here.
The impacts of the eruption were not limited to areas in close proximity to Mount St. Helens. The volcano unleashed pyroclastic flows that spewed ash miles high into the sky. In the hours that followed, the ash spread east, plunging communities hundreds of miles away into a dusty darkness.
A pyroclastic blast swept down the northeast flank.
There was a high eruption plume that lasted for several hours, reached 17 kilometers above sea level. And the pyroclastic flows that issued from the volcano also lofted ash into the atmosphere.
The ash quickly began moving east. Chris Ballou got caught up in it with his mother and brother. They were driving home to Seattle from Spokane. They had no idea what was unfolding.
So we got, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 miles away from Spokane and started to see this big dark cloud coming at us. And we thought, this is going to be a big storm. And the cloud got bigger and bigger, and pretty soon it went over the car, and pretty soon it went all the way behind us, and pretty soon the horizon was just a strip, and then it closed off, and it was dark. And somewhere in there we turned on the radio and realized that this is not a storm, this is a volcanic eruption.
As the cloud enveloped them, ash began falling out of the sky.
And when it started to fall, the windows of the car got hot to the touch, and that was kind of spooky.
Despite this, they kept going.
We thought, we can make it through, and we just have to power through, and then we'll get to the sunshine on the other side of the ash cloud. But it just didn't. It was relentless.
Chris says the ash was falling so densely, his mom began to experience vertigo while driving.
She couldn't tell what was up, what was down, what was right, what was left. So my brother and I had to look out the windows in the back seat and tell her when she was driving off the road.
Some of those harrowing moments were actually recorded on a boombox his mom had in the car.
You're on the right, but you're okay. Doing good. You're going off to the left. You're going to go off the road, right? In a couple seconds. Mom, turn right. No, I'm not. I see the left one. I see the markers. I do too.
Eventually, their system broke down.
She drove off the road into a ditch, and the wheels that had the power to drive the car were up in the air.
His mom kept her cool and managed to flag down a truck to pull them out of the ditch. They got back on the road just to be turned around at Moses Lake where the highway was shut down. So they drove back to Spokane.
The atmosphere in Spokane was really surreal, kind of like another planet. Everything was covered with ash. Cars were kicking it up. You had to still be really careful even though it had stopped falling because it was just so easy to kick up.
The eruption sent 540 million tons of ash into the air.
The ash and plume is now into the western sections of Montana, moving down toward northeastern Wyoming.
The May 18 ashfall deposit extended all the way across the American West, and there were eyewitness accounts of some ashfall out to the east coast.
In just 3 days, the ash cloud spread across the U.S. After 15 days, it circled the globe. While the eruption was cataclysmic, the mountain wasn't finished. Mount St. Helens produced numerous smaller explosive and dome-building eruptions through 1986, and again from 2004 to 2008.
And still ahead on this special edition of K2 News Tonight, what scientists have learned over the last 45 years studying Mount St. Helens and how that knowledge is being applied to preparing for future eruptions. The eruption of Mount St. Helens was not only a life-changing event for people living near the volcano.
Now that it was clear what Mount St. Helens was capable of, it also served as a catalyst, inspiring new innovation and research related to volcanoes, and sparked the creation of a research center in Southwest Washington. K2's Jesse Satin has a closer look.
Prior to 1980, there was no U.S. Geological Survey office in the Northwest. Once Mount St. Helens started showing signs of unrest, the agency sent scientists in from its bases in Denver and Hawaii.
We're trying to learn more about the Cascades.
It's a new experience for you.
Definitely.
2 years after the eruption, President Reagan and Congress created the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument.
There was a lot of features that were pretty significant to necessitate a bunch of protection measures, as well as for the public safety aspects of it.
The same year, the USGS established the Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington.
Over the past few decades, we've really taken on a lot more public outreach and public engagement, really trying to educate emergency managers about the volcanoes in their backyard, what those volcanoes are capable of doing, what the hazards are, and also expanding our monitoring network.
According to the USGS, Mount St. Helens is the most active volcano in the lower 48 and the most likely in the Cascades to erupt again. Today, more than 20 monitoring stations operate on and around the volcano, making it one of the most actively monitored volcanoes in the country. Through those monitoring stations, scientists watch earthquake activity, track changes in ground deformation, and measure gases escaping the Earth.
That data comes back here within a second or sometimes even less after it's been recorded at the volcano. This is an earthquake that just came in here.
The seismic instruments they use are incredibly sensitive.
You can see this earthquake here is the same earthquake that's being recorded at Mount St. Helens, but we're further away here at Adams.
The observatory works with partners like the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network at the University of Washington to analyze these signals.
Mount St. Helens has several earthquakes a day, has several tens of earthquakes that are really, really small up in the dome. We know that, but if we were to see an increase in the number of events, then that would be something that would get our interest.
Some of these are sort of dome material from Mount St. Helens.
Emily Johnson Johnson is a research geologist at the observatory. She studies rocks from past eruptions to understand what was happening deep below ground before the magma made its way to the surface.
So there were a couple of periods of activity starting around 3,000 to about 2,000 or so years ago where there was a lot of basaltic activity. And these eruptions were much more similar to what is happening today if you look at the eruptions from Kilauea, a volcano in Hawaii. And after that time window, it switched back into what we kind of know about Mount St. Helens today, having more of these larger explosive eruptions and forming lava domes.
That past activity can help give a clue to the future.
Do we expect Mount St. Helens to keep doing what it's been doing, or might there be a return to this older, different style of activity?
While Emily Johnson studies what goes on underground, Alexa Van Eaton looks above.
Volcanic ash is really hard to get rid of. So after May 18, there was an enormous cleanup activity of folks downwind who had to deal with this stuff, covering their roofs and their roads and their cars.
The ash can also be catastrophic for air travel. One of her focuses is improving models for how volcanic ash travels.
We now have computer models like Ash 3D that can forecast clouds that carry this ashfall.
Don't go anywhere. When we return after a short break, we explore how different agencies would come together to respond should Mount St. Helens awaken again. As we just heard, scientists with the USGS are studying Mount St. Helens to prepare for the possibility of a future eruptive event.
If another eruption does occur, the response will include several agencies from federal to state to county to local. We spoke with several of these agencies to learn what's being done today to prepare for the future. The blast from the 1980 eruption covered more than 230 square miles. Over $1 billion in damage was incurred. Knowing what we know now,
my ask of folks that if they think something's happening, notify the local jurisdiction. An hour or two can make a tremendous amount of difference.
that plan of action starts with getting information from the experts.
As soon as we were to start changing the alert level status of a volcano, that triggers a lot of interaction with a lot of communities.
The USGS says they periodically run tabletop exercises along with other agencies to simulate various response scenarios.
We are constantly in communication, even almost 45 years afterwards. Plans are as good as they can be, but it's where they actually get implemented is the true test of them.
That response would come together under an incident command structure, creating a chain of command and communication structure for the different agencies.
That's a federal structure that we all have to be trained in through FEMA.
Summer Shire is the Skamania County Sheriff, where Mount St. Helens is located. She points to the 2023 landslide that wiped out a portion of Spirit Lake Highway, stranding 12 people at Johnson Ridge Observatory as an example.
If you had to get these people, then what does this look like? In Department of Transportation, because that's their highway, how does that pan out? And then Cowlitz County is just on the outside of it.
It was a Skamania County event, but they had to come through Cowlitz County to get to it on a state highway on federal land under a federal park. And this is what I hope comes out of the collaboration planning, is that we can identify a person or a group that will be in charge instead of this. And that's much what happened during the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens.
The scientists monitoring Mount St. Helens say we will have advance warning of an eruption, although the situation can evolve quickly.
In 2004, when Mount St. Helens reawakened, it actually went from very quiet background activity to its first explosion over a span of a week.
Emergency responders urge people living nearby to keep preparedness in the back of their minds.
Evacuations are a very difficult thing to do. It's not just get in your car and leave.
There are no current signs of eruption activity increasing, but if it does,
the chances that we are going to see May 18, 1980 size eruption again are relatively minimal.
It's just a really unique and treasured landscape that is known globally and lived locally, and it's got lots more that seeks to be understood. It's just whether or not we're able to listen.
The Cascades Volcano Observatory offers a free volcano notification service anyone can sign up for. They'll email you updates on what's going on with Mount St. Helens and other Cascades volcanoes. Counties also have emergency alert services you can sign up for as well.
We'll have more information on how to sign up for those on our website, katu.com. That does it for this special Mount St. Helens 45th anniversary edition of K2 News. Thanks so much for joining us.